So now we've gone through blood, let's move on with the cardiovascular system to really the one that takes center stage, the heart. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about the interior and exterior parts of the human heart. We'll talk about the path of blood through the cardiac circuits. We'll look at the size, shape, and location of the heart, as well as the atrial and ventricular systole and diastole, and the cardiac conducting system, as well as what the process and purpose of an electrocardiogram is, and then a little bit about fetal heart development. For this video, we're going to focus on one thing and one thing only, and that is heart anatomy. So by the time you're done with this, you should be able to describe the location and position of the heart within the body. We'll talk about the internal and external anatomy of the heart, the tissue layers we see in that, how the heart's structure leads to its function as a pump. We'll look at atrial and ventricular systole and diastole and systemic circulation to pulmonary circulation, kind of look at those two pathways, and then look at the pathway of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood through the chambers of the heart. And we'll even take a peek at some cases of when this doesn't develop properly and how that affects the oxygenation of blood. So let's start with the location and position of the heart. And I know you're probably thinking, I know where the heart is, right? It's in my chest. And yes, you are correct, but we want to get a little more detailed from that. And we want to at least attach maybe some new vocabulary, or maybe not so much new vocabulary, but vocabulary we maybe haven't seen in a while to the location and position. So here we have our heart right in the thoracic cavity there and slightly to the left. But if we take a closer look, right, we see this dotted line in white, and this is outlining what we call the mediastinum. So the heart's going to be within that mediastinum, in the lower part of it, and also within its own little pocket, its own little membrane called the pericardium. So the heart is going to have its own little sac surrounding it called the pericardium. If we look from the side, the sagittal view, how it's placed, we see that we have the heart here with the base right here, the apex of the heart, the little point of the heart, in this case would be facing us, so we don't really see it here, and we see that the blood vessels, the major ones coming from the heart, right, are actually going to come up and wrap around and behind the heart, and like in the aorta here, we're seeing it actually extend down into the abdominal cavity. Now, the interesting thing that I find with the cardiovascular system is that we actually have like two routes that blood takes. And depending on which side of the heart is pumping that blood, it can go one route or the other. The two different routes are the pulmonary circuit, which will take blood to the lungs, and the systemic circuit, which will take blood to the body. The right side of the heart is responsible for pumping blood to the lungs, while the left side of the heart has the much bigger job of pumping blood to the body. Now, if we take a peek up in this picture over here, we see the pathway with these arrows that blood takes through the heart. Now, note that we see blue, that's going to show deoxygenated blood, while red shows oxygenated blood. I want to just, even though we'll go into this again when we get into the blood vessel chapter, I do want to make a point to say, while it is true in most cases, veins are not always blue and arteries are not always red. The pulmonary circuit is a prime example of where we see that being reversed. So I want to at least point that out now, because you're going to start looking at all these pictures, and I want to address that before you get too far in. Arteries are defined, or I should say arteries and veins are defined by the direction they take blood in relation to the heart. So in arteries, they always carry blood away from the heart. They're removing blood from the heart, or moving blood further away from the heart. Veins move blood towards the heart. That's the key definition for those both. Veins move blood to the heart, arteries move blood away from the heart. Most arteries will appear red and most veins will appear blue. But I'm going to point out to you an example where we see that's not true and why I want to break that coloring, using coloring as your definition because of this. So take a look at the heart that's up here in the corner. We look over on this side. We see the right pulmonary arteries and right pulmonary veins. Now, remember, arteries carry blood away, so we see our arrows are going out away towards the heart. But those arteries are colored blue. Meanwhile, our right pulmonary veins, which are pulling blood towards the heart, are colored in red. So with the pulmonary circuit, the oxygenation of blood, dependent when it comes to the arteries and veins, is opposite of what you would expect. And if you think of it, it makes sense, right? That the blood being pumped away from the heart to the lungs is not going to have oxygen because it hasn't gone to the lungs yet, right? And the lungs are the ones doing the oxygenating. And that once blood returns from the lungs back to the heart, it's going to be fresh, full of oxygen. So that coloring makes sense when we think of it that way, and we use the right definitions for arteries and veins. Okay, so now that I got that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about how blood flows through. Blood returning from the body is going to come through the inferior and superior vena cava, right? So these big blood vessels are going to dump blood into our first chamber, which is the right atrium. From there, we will push blood through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, we will pass through the pulmonary semilunar valves into the pulmonary trunk, which will then branch off to form the right and left pulmonary arteries. We circle through the lungs, we come back through the right and left pulmonary veins, and we immediately dump into the left atrium. When we pass through the right-left atrium, we will go through the mitral or the bicuspid valve. Your book talks about both. I don't care which one you use. I will probably use them interchangeably myself as well, because both those names are pretty common for that particular valve. So we pass through the mitral valve into the left ventricle, and then from the left ventricle through the aortic semilunar valves into the aorta, the aortic arch, where we will branch off and start basically going off to the rest of the body. And then we cycle back again, right, as blood comes from the body back towards the heart. Now, remember earlier I mentioned the pericardium. And if we remember from like the very beginning of this class, we talked about membranes and the layers of these membranes. So we probably haven't really thought about that since then, but let's go ahead and take ourselves back, take a peek and remind ourselves. So here we're looking at the heart. On the left here is the stuff on the very, very inside, and all the way on the right is going to be the very outside of the heart. So right side is out, left side is in. If we work our way from right to left, so we're working our way from the outside in, we have the fibrous pericardium on the very outside, the parietal layer of the serous pericardium, in this like pink, right, the pericardial cavity, and then the epicardium, which is going to be the visceral layer of the pericardium. So we have a bunch going on here. Let's break it down. Remember that serous membranes was like the punching into a bag, right? So we have the fibrous pericardium that's like kind of tough on the outside, the parietal serous pericardium, the pericardial cavity, which is the gap between, and then the visceral pericardium is in this like purplish lilac color. And then right up against this we get the myocardium. Remember, myo we think muscle, cardium we think heart, so this is the heart muscle, and then the endocardium is the inner lining. In this case we're looking at the inside at the left ventricle. So now let's go ahead and take a look at some of the surface features of the heart. So these are all the pieces we see on the outside. There's a really long list. You'll have to know most, if not all of these, so you do want to study the heart significantly. It's probably the most challenging part of this system is the heart, so do really try to spend some time on it. Compared to like the blood and the blood vessels, If you've been practicing your regional terms and putting those to memory, the blood vessels are not so bad. And the blood doesn't have a whole lot going on for it in comparison, so that one's not really big. But this right here is probably going to be the thing you're going to have to practice, is all the features of the heart. But I'll at least kind of take us around and kind of talk about some of the things that are similar, and talk about maybe some things that can maybe help us remember the structures. So first and foremost, let's talk about the big ones, which are going to be the chambers and the major blood vessels. You cannot get through this without knowing those. I guarantee you're going to be asked something about those, right? Whether it's what they do or the direction or flow of blood through them, or just identifying them. I haven't gotten that far yet, but you will have to know those components. Like, you cannot get through anatomy and not know those. So if we look at the top picture where we're looking at the anterior, the front view of the heart, we see the atria, right, on the right and left. And again, remember, right and left is flip-flopped because we're looking at the heart from our perspective. But remember, the heart is positioned and the left and right is positioned from the perspective of the person who owns it. So this would be like we were standing face to face looking someone in the face. So our left would be their right. Back to the atria. The atria are these more maroon colored structures we see here that, in my opinion, almost look like chewed gum, in the picture at least. And these are going to be responsible for receiving blood from the systems, right? So no matter which one you're looking at, you know you're receiving blood from the body or the lungs, right, in these. They will feed into the ventricles, which we can't see the separation of the ventricles on the outside. We'll have to go deeper in to see that separation, but we can still tell right from left. So the atria will pump blood into each of those ventricles on their respective sides. We have the major blood vessels, which include the superior and inferior vena cava, the pulmonary trunk, which will then branch into the pulmonary arteries. We have the pulmonary veins that are responsible for bringing blood back to the heart, and then the aorta, which we can really kind of break down into a couple regions. We have the ascending aorta because it's going up, the aortic arch because we're wrapping around, forming like a horseshoe. We don't see it here, but we'd have the descending aorta, which would come back down behind the heart. And we see that we have these branches of the aorta that are going to go up towards like the neck and the head. The brachiocephalic, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian. So those are the major components here, right, that we see here. And we see some of them back here as well. Now, so we're looking at the back view. So remember, the left ventricle will actually be on our left, and the right will be on our true right. We see the back end of these blood vessels. So we see the back end of the aorta. We see the pulmonary arteries and veins. And we see the inferior and superior vena cava. Now, as nice as it would be to just have to know those basic components, we're also going to talk about some of the blood vessels that service the heart. And these are important, right? Because while the heart is pumping blood to the rest of the body, it begs the question, who's taking blood to the heart? Because we can't pull nutrients and oxygen from the chambers themselves, right? We're going to have blood vessels that service the actual heart muscle. So let's go ahead and talk about some of those. So on the front, right, we have all these blue and red lines coming all over. I'm going to start on the left and just work my way over. So we have the right coronary artery. We have the right marginal artery. We have the anterior cardiac vein right here. And we have the small cardiac vein. So to try to remember that, we have the right coronary artery, the anterior cardiac vein, right, named for the side and where they're facing, the right marginal and small right marginal artery, small cardiac vein. Those guys are kind of on the side there and coming down. Over on the other side, we have the left coronary artery, the great cardiac vein, and the anterior interventricular artery, which if you think about it, right, it's on the front and it's going between the ventricles. Now you may have noticed a pattern in that most of these arteries have the word coronary in them and most of the veins have cardiac in them. You'll notice that trend. Keep that in your head because that's part of the naming system we have with the blood vessels that service the heart itself. We see it coming around on the backside too, where we see that great cardiac vein. It's continuing right here. We see the circumflex branch of the left coronary artery, the posterior interventricular artery, so the one again going between the ventricles, the middle cardiac vein, and the right coronary artery, kind of wrapping around on the back end. So not all of the blood vessels follow that pattern, but a good number of them do. And so you want to just kind of keep that in your head. If you see coronary or you're thinking coronary, you should be thinking of an artery. Cardiac, you should be thinking of a vein. If we look at how the muscle is actually wrapping around, or like the direction the fibers run, we have a kind of cool pattern in my opinion. We look at the atrial musculature, we see that they kind of form like little C's or like circles. But when we look down at the ventricular side, it's almost like a figure 8. And if we take a slice, right, we take a cross section of that heart, this is something you definitely want to pay attention to, because this difference in the structure of the ventricles and their muscle really plays into their functions. And that's something we want to pay attention. It's the whole point of anatomy before you go into physio right now, is that you understand structure before you start talking about the function. So let's talk about structure and then we'll talk briefly how that leads to function. So if we notice the right ventricle, the muscle layer is thin, right? We see it's thin. Even here when it's contracted, it's still relatively thin when we compare it to the ventricle on the left, right? The comparison, it's a no-brainer, right? The layer here is much thicker. And same thing over here, much thicker when contracted. If we think about it, that makes sense. Because the right side of the heart is only responsible for pumping blood to the lungs. It's not a big system. But the left side of the heart has the challenging job of pumping blood throughout the entire body, including up to the brain and all the way down to the feet. So because of that, it's going to have to be much more powerful. And in order to have more power, you're going to have bigger, stronger, thicker muscle. Since we're looking at the interior, let's take a deeper look at the rest of the interior of the heart. Again, we'll talk about some of the main things and then we'll go into some of the specific structures and talk about those. So let's start with the major structures. Again, with the artery, with the different blood vessels, the atria and the ventricles. We notice the atria here are kind of like these swellings. They can fill with blood. Each of them are connected to their respective ventricles, and in between those atria and ventricles, we see the valves. On the right side, we have the tricuspid valve, and in a second, we'll see why it's called tricuspid. On the left side, we have the mitral, also known as the bicuspid valve. Like I said, I'm not going to care if you use mitral or bicuspid, whichever one you're more used to. Both are acceptable for me. Now, connecting the ventricles to their respective blood vessels, we see the semilunar valves, named for the blood vessels they pump into. The pulmonary valves opening up to the pulmonary trunk, and the aortic valve pumping up into the aorta. So pulmonary trunk and aorta, we see our left and right pulmonary arteries, left and right pulmonary veins, that's all the same. Let's talk about some of the other things we haven't pointed out yet, because all these big structures are things that you generally probably should have covered in like Bio 5 if you took Bio 5 as your prerequisite. If not, take some time to learn these, but let's go ahead and look at some of the other structures that are a little bit, that are probably new. One is the fossa ovalis. This is a leftover of the foramen ovale that you have when you are a baby, when you're like in the womb. But it closes up and leaves behind this little tiny divot, this little like valley. In most people, this fully closes. It can occasionally not fully close, and we'll look at that later. So these chordae tendineae, these basically are what are casually called the heartstrings. And yeah, I guess if you're looking, you can kind of see that, right? Because there are these little stringy bits right here. But they have a very important job, and that is to prevent these tricuspid and bicuspid valves from basically opening up backwards. They anchor them down so that when they close, they close. Think of like a door that can only open up one way, right? You have like a hinge in a frame that prevents you from opening up the door the opposite way, right? So the chordae tendineae or the chordae tendineae pull that function off very well. We also have the trabeculae carneae. The trabeculae carneae, this is going to help prevent suction from developing that we don't want. So by having these like little like divots and whatnot, having this uneven surface is going to help prevent basically from the heart experiencing that suction. And then just below that we see what's called the moderator band. Now if you notice, the moderator band we see on the right, but we don't see it on the left. And so this is something unique to the right side. The whole point of the moderator band is to help be part of the electrical conduction pathway in the heart. So this is going to basically help with the heart contracting the muscles together so that we have a regular heartbeat that is consistent and organized. And then moving over to the left, we see the endo, myo, and epicardium. And those are just the layers. They're just kind of shown with like the lines. So the endocardium would be the inner lining inside the ventricles and atria. The myocardium is the muscle, and then the epicardium is going to be on the outside of that. We see that between the ventricles, we have what's called the interventricular septum, which is basically dividing the left from the right. The papillary muscles, which the heartstrings, the chordae tendineae are anchoring to. And so like it's not too crazy, but there's definitely some new components that maybe you haven't seen before. Again, this is really the bread and butter of this body system, so you'll really want to get familiar with the heart. Now let's go ahead and talk about what happens if something goes wrong. These are congenital heart defects that people can be born with, simply because there's things that can either go wrong or things that don't like maybe close or develop properly. So like I mentioned earlier with that fossa that we saw earlier, that was the leftover from the foramen ovale. If the foramen ovale does not fully close, we actually end up pushing some of that oxygenated blood from the left back into the right side because it's joining the left and the right together as a bypass. We'll talk about why these things are kind of more important when we get to development in the next video. Sometimes the aorta can actually narrow, so in this case we see coarctation of the aorta, where you see that super thin, really narrow part. That's going to be very problematic for effectively getting blood to the body. We see this one, this patent ductus arteriosus. This is where the ductus arteriosus remains open instead of closing, and so some of the blood from the aortic arch can actually make their way into the pulmonary arteries instead. And so we end up pushing blood that's somewhat oxygenated back to the lungs instead of to the body. And then lastly here, we see that we have this septal defect, right? This is tetralogy of Fallot. Basically, the septum does not fully divide the left and right ventricles, which means deoxygenated blood and oxygenated blood get mixed when they are pushed up to the aorta. So rather than having really fresh, super oxygenated blood in the aorta pumped out to the body, we're seeing it like somewhat oxygenated, but not fully, which is why it appears purple in the picture here. Continuing on, we have the cardiac skeleton. This is just going to give us a framework. So we've taken a cross section of the heart here. We see the back at the top of the screen and then the front at the bottom. And this is just to show us what these valves can look like. Now it says cardiac skeleton. That does not mean it's made of bone. It just means it's providing a framework, right? So we have a framework to the heart. And then here we see those chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles, again holding those heartstrings in place. And then we look at what's going on in terms of the cardiac cycle, which we were talking about the heartbeat. We have really 3 steps. We have cardiac diastole, where everybody's relaxed, right? All 4 chambers are relaxed. Blood flows into the heart, no problem. Then we have atrial systole and ventricular diastole. This is where the atria have contracted and the ventricles have not contracted. The ventricles are relaxed. This is going to force the blood from the atria into the ventricles. And then atrial diastole and ventricular systole, that's when now the ventricles contract and the atria relax. So because of that, the ventricles contract, they push blood out into their respective blood vessels, like the pulmonary trunk or the aorta, to go out to the lungs and the rest of the body. And if we remember, we had those valves, right? I've just been calling them tricuspid and bicuspid and whatnot, and semilunar valves, but let's go ahead and give them some like better names than that. We have the bicuspid and tricuspid belong to the category called the atrioventricular valves. Atrioventricular, right? Because these are valves between the atria and the ventricles. And then the semilunar valves, which includes the pulmonary and the aortic valves, these are just called that because the pieces of the valve look like little half moons. They look like little crescents, and so that's why they get the name semilunar. Remember, aortic is going to be between the left ventricle and the aorta. Pulmonary will be between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. So they're named for the blood vessel that blood is pushed into when it passes through that valve. So this is just in general what it looks like, and so we see like the little half moon shapes, right, of the aortic and the pulmonary valves. And then you may be wondering why tricuspid, why bicuspid? This is why. Tricuspid, 1, 2, 3. Bicuspid, 1, 2. That's it. Nothing too crazy there. Now let's take a peek what happens during the different parts of the cardiac cycle. So here we're going to look at what those valves look like when the ventricles are relaxed. So keep in mind, when the ventricles relax, we are actively trying to put blood or push blood into the ventricles. That means the tricuspid and bicuspid valves have to be open. And so this is what they look like if we're looking from the top down. This is what those valves look like when they're open. Down at the bottom here, we see what it looks like when it's open from the side. But when the time comes for the ventricles to contract, we have to snap those valves shut. So this looks kind of like the picture we saw before. So the tricuspid, bicuspid valves are shut, but because the ventricles are contracting, the semilunar valves actually need to open so we can allow blood to flow through. So we see that both the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve are wide open so that we can push blood through to the lungs and the rest of the body. And if we look at an echocardiogram, we can actually see what this looks like. You can see them opening and closing, right, from different angles here. And if we think about what the heart sounds like in the cardiac cycle, right, and we're not going to get too crazy into this in anatomy. In physiology, you'll get more into this. But we can actually hear when certain valves open and close. So the first sound, the lub sound, is going to be when the semilunar valves open and the atrioventricular valves close, right? This is, if these are closing and the semilunars are opening, that means the ventricles are contracting. And then the second sound, the dub, right? This is where the semilunar valves close and the AV valves open. This is when the atria are contracting, the ventricles relax. And so if we wanted to hear this sound, depending on which valve we're trying to listen to, we have 4 points we can use a stethoscope on, or use a stethoscope to use to listen to these. So if we wanted to listen to the pulmonary valve, we'd listen to it using the green dot. If we wanted to listen to the aortic valve, we'd look at the purple. If we wanted to listen to tricuspid, we would use the blue circle, and then pink circle would be good for listening to the mitral valve or the bicuspid valve.